What's up ladies, gentlemen, people, extraterrestrial aliens and everything in between? The 5-man signing window just closed, and you know what that means, it's power rankings time. Today I'm going to do my very early power ranking of all 20 teams. Feel free to leave your rankings down in the comments below as we will definitely disagree on at least one pick. I'm going to be going in order of worst to best, go over some strong points of each team, and then talk about the rest of the roster and coaching staff. This will also probably become very outdated very quickly since the off-season isn't over yet, but with all intros out of the way, let's get started. Starting off in dead last we have the London Spitfire. As much as I hate to say it, this team just doesn't look up to par with the rest of the league. The best part of the team appears to be their 2 hits can DPS. Shax and Spark were by far the best players on London last year, as Shax has a very good Tracer and Reaper, meanwhile Sparker is a great all-around hitscan and is especially good on Hangzhou and Cassidy, and Backbone makes for a nice extra piece seeing as he has a pretty good Echo. However, I think this signing was a big missed opportunity to promote your kids, but the rest of the team just doesn't feel super good to me. Bringing back Hades might be the most questionable move of the off-season. The org has said that he is a super good player but just didn't get to show it on the virtual stage. However, that still isn't enough to convince me that he should be brought back. His main tank play was mediocre to downright atrocious at times last year. His Rhine and Orisu especially looked awful. His Winston and Ball weren't as bad, but still weren't super good, and I personally don't see him getting much better. Poco could be a decent piece. Despite not being able to play last year, he's always been a consistently good option, especially on Diva. However, I fear the competition has surpassed him. Then for the supports, Provide and Admiral both seem okay. I personally really like Admiral's Lucio and Provide's Zen, however I can't trust these guys to stand up to any of the top support lines in NA. Finally, the coaching. They have Christopher as head coach, which could be an okay signing. His results with Philly have been pretty good, and Spiller could also be a good signing. As soon as he joined the team mid-season, the team instantly got better, and I'm a big fan of his Twitch VOD reviews. His analysis is great and I highly recommend checking those out, but my main issue with this coaching staff is Commander X. After last year's 1-15 disaster, I don't think this guy ever deserves a coaching job again. I would have much preferred if Chris and Spiller were just duo head coaches. Overall, these all-EU rosters historically haven't been super good. Think back to Season 1 Mayhem, Season 2 Eternal, Season 4 Spitfire. It just usually never works, and I don't see this year's Spitfire being any different. Florida Mayhem. This is another team that doesn't have a lot of incredible pieces. Let's start with the strong point of the team, which seems to be Hydran. I think this is the guy who will be getting a lot of the flashy plays, and I'm super excited to see him in action. Throughout the past 2 years in NA contenders, he has found nothing but success, and he is an absolute monster on heroes like Tracer, Ashe, and Widow, but aside from him the rest of the roster just feels mediocre. Bringing back Checkmate doesn't seem super promising to me. However, I don't think he got a fair chance to prove himself, and his hero pool consists of heroes like Echo, Tracer and Genji. Then there's Mirror, who has a very weird role on the team. His hero pool is very weird, playing a lot of Echo, Torb and Doomfist, Zarya and Brig, but he seems like a very situational player who'll come into play those niche heroes, and maybe he'll even play all 3 roles like he did on Glads in Season 3. The tanks and supports all look to be around C tier. Adam finally getting signed after being trashed on by the Valiant, and their horrible management is such a relief. This guy really deserved a chance to prove himself, and I'm so happy he's now getting that. Big fan of his diva. Someone should also be good coming from the highly rated Team CC. I don't know as much about this guy, but I've heard good things about his Rhine, and Sermaged has seen some pretty good results in NA and EU contenders playing for multiple different teams. His Zen has looked pretty good in my opinion. And it's also important to mention that he is the first Saudi Arabian player to be in the league, so it's nice to see some new representation. Then there's Anamo, who has a pretty good Mercy and Lucio, but keep in mind that this is his first time playing with a mixed roster, so there might be some communication issues, but I don't think that'll be a big issue. Then finally there's the coaching. Gunbu as head coach should be pretty good. He helped the Valiant be a pretty successful team in seasons 1 and 3, although he did switch over to Valorant for a year, but I trust him to re-adapt. Then for the assistant coaches Daiwon and McGravy. Daiwon doesn't do much for me, but McGravy is the one I want to talk about. Rejoining his former team as a coach is pretty cool. As for how I think he'll do as a coach, I think he'll be pretty good. He has experience as a player and he does some pretty good VOD reviews on his Twitch channel. Overall, this Mayhem roster has potential, but just has too much unproven talent for me to put them any higher. LA Valiant. The Valiant seem significantly better than they did last year, at least based off the signings they have so far. The DPS line of Deer and Innovation seem to be the best part of the team so far. Both were a part of Team CC, the most dominant team in Chinese contenders, and they rolled the competition on Tracer and Dash. Then they signed Becky, who seems like an okay flex DPS on heroes like Echo. However, I would have preferred to see a better alternative flex DPS be signed. Then their support line consists of Coldest and Lengze, who feel very unproven. Coldest, who barely played in 2021, and Lengze, who has found some pretty good results recently in Chinese contenders with Team Chaser. From what we've seen, Coldest is an okay Ana and Zen, meanwhile Lengze is solid on every main support. They also signed Wu Yao as a player coach, and I think he'll be okay as a player, mostly playing Div, and a pretty good coach seeing his most recent results are all pretty good. Then finally the coaching, we have Wu Yao as discussed, and Nihil from the dominant Team CC, who should make for a strong head coach. This team overall feels very strong compared to last year, but that isn't saying much considering that last year's Valiant might have been the worst team to ever play in the league. So you might be wondering why I have them so low. That comes in the fact that they are gambling on a lot of young talent who have never been in the league much. Most of the guys they signed were bench warmers for other Overwatch League teams, and I think they were bench warmers for a reason. Although a lot of them went back to contenders to prove themselves, I still think they won't be that good. Don't get me wrong, the potential is there. I just feel a lot of other APAC teams are just more talented and more proven at an Overwatch League level. And yes, this take is just a bit out of spite because I'm a former Valiant fan. Guangzhou Charge. After a very disappointing 2021 season, I still don't know if I'm ready to trust this roster. Starting off with the good, I'm still very confident in the DPS line. Eileen, Choice A1 and Develop is a lethal trio. Choice A1 popped off last year on Tracer, Echo, May, Farah, and Genji. Meanwhile Eileen did the same but on Sombra, Hanzo, Cassidy, Genji and Doomfist. Both of those guys are very flexible and add a promising player like Develop on top of it, and you have a stellar DPS rotation. Despite only playing one map, what he showed on Tracer that one time against the Fusion was pretty spectacular. I trust in him to be an incredible hitscan player. Krong is another good piece. I thought his Sigma and Zarya have both been very good throughout the past 2 years, but he isn't super good on Diva. However, the rest of this team either feels mediocre or unproven. Rio has been pretty outclassed with his main tank play in my opinion. There are just so many better main tanks in APAC. Then they signed Unique and Molly as their support line, and these guys definitely have potential to be a good support line, but I don't think they'll be super good personally. Unique has some good results in contenders, just not good enough, and Molly was mostly benched on Shanghai, so he feels a bit unproven, but he has potential as his Ana and Zen were both okay when he played them. And then finally the coaching looks pretty worrying. They resigned Sung Woo as head coach, and this guy has been with the Charge every season with varying success, but he knows the team well. and Extra, who is a Chinese coach who has a decent amount of experience in Chinese contenders. Overall, this team has some good and promising pieces, just the coaching holds them back for me. I just am not confident that this coaching staff can bring the potential out of the unproven players this team has. Hangzhou Spark. This team feels so confusing. Starting with the good, Shy. What he showed on the Spark last year was top-level Overwatch. On Echo, Hanzo, Cassidy, Ashe, and even Tracer and Sombra was super impressive. Guangzhou is another guy I have high hopes for, seeing as his Winston and Wrecking Ball were both very good. I'm also excited that they brought back Ligay. I was disappointed to never see him play last year and am excited to see what he can bring to this team if his mental health is good enough for him to play. But the rest of this team is either gambling on rookie talent or mediocre. Flex DPS Alpha E, Hitscan Pineapple, and Flex Support Irony were all promoted from Spark's Academy team, and most of the results this team has put up have all been very impressive. And I am especially excited about Alpha E because I really liked his Echo in contenders. Then there's Superic, who was pulled from Team CC. And this guy has been the main support for this roster throughout all their success in 2020 and 2021, so he is another one to look out for with his spectacular Mercy and Brig play. But I am not too sure about the other guys. Pineapple will likely sit on the bench for Shy despite being talented on hitscan heroes like Ashe and Widow, and then in Irony's case I just think the other flex supports in APAC are better despite having a good Zen. Then we have to talk about their decision to bring back Architect and Burner. Bringing back Burner really bothers me, as I personally think he was the weakest member of the Sparks starting lineup last year. Ligay was probably the guy they were hoping to be a starter after his dominance in contenders with Team CC, but his health issues led to Burner starting and he did not look pretty on a game-to-game basis, especially on Diva, and having 2 supports and 3 tanks just feels weird. Then Architect was kind of just washed compared to his days on Shock, so I don't expect him to play much except for maybe a Genji Metu if that ever happens. Then there's the coaching, which is a mess just like last year. 4 coaches with the infamous Chengun as one of them. This guy is known to have bad reads on the meta and just generally run confusing comps. Despite having 2 grand finals appearances, those were more player-based than him being a good coach in my opinion. Miro is cool to see return to the league as a coach, after his inspiring Winston pre-Overwatch league, but the rest of the coaches haven't done anything special. Don't expect much out of Neko and Zhao. Overall, this team has potential in a lot of their players, just the coaching doesn't feel very stable. Vancouver Titans. After a 1-win season, the Titans were in big need of some changes, and they did that by getting rid of their entire 2021 roster and rebuilding off of mostly Western talent from NA and EU contenders and a few pre-existing Overwatch League players. Starting with the good, I think the best part of this team is Mazza. After being a grand finalist and a top 3 main support in the league, he should definitely bring some very much needed stability to this team. It's pretty rare we see a main support be the best part of a team, but that is the case for the Titans. But looking at the rest of the team, the DPS line also looks pretty solid. Shockwave returning to his former team is pretty fun to see. He was pretty solid on Ashe, Cassidy, Sim and Sombra during the little playtime he saw, so he makes for a good piece. But then we have Aspire, who I can also see being a hard carry on the Tracer. He was putting up pretty good performances on a pretty mediocre Defiant roster. He'll likely mostly just play Tracer, but that's good enough seeing as he has a lot of potential. Then there's Aztec, who will be one of Mazza's support partners, and he is coming off of barely seeing any playtime on the Defiant last year. Personally, I think this guy never had a fair shot to prove himself since he was benched for Lestro, but I don't see him standing up to all the flex support talent that NA has to offer. Then the rest of the roster is from contenders and they all have a lot of potential. Skyripper saw lots of good results in EU contenders with British Hurricane and could be a really good flex support for double flex support metas. False. Currently the only tank player is an off-tank who has also found lots of success this time in NA contenders. To round out this roster they have Seiko as the flex DPS, and I personally think they could have gone for a player like Yakids instead. Seiko is good, don't get me wrong, I just think they could have gotten someone a little better. Finally, the coaching staff. This is the part that I hate. They literally kept the exact same coaching staff from last year and the year before, Flabby and Pew. Why? They've found no good results from this staff and it upsets me that they can't go for anyone else. I don't trust these guys to bring out the potential this roster possesses, because historically they've failed to do that. Overall this team has a lot of potential, I just don't see them doing super well because of the coaching. Washington Justice. This is a weird one, starting off with the good, it's obviously Decay. No matter what happens to this team, Decay is always a reliable playmaker on Tracer, Reaper, Ashe, Widow, Cassidy, Hangzhou, and Sim. Happy and Assassin also round out this DPS line nicely, despite being super up and down last year. Both Assassin and Happy were superstars at their peak. Happy on hit skins like Cassidy, Ashe, Widow, and Sim, and Assassin on flex DPS like Sombra, Echo, and May. I think if coached properly this DPS trio can be deadly. The tank line also has a lot of promise. Despite not being the superstar we all expected him to be, Mag was still pretty good last year. I personally thought he was top 3 on Rhine and Winston, despite being a little lacking on Ball and Orisu especially. Then there's Kalios, who in my opinion is getting a bit too much hate. Sure, losing Fury sucks, but Kalios was still a pretty good player last year on Zarya and Sig. I don't think he's top tier, but I think he could be better than people think. But the part of this roster that really concerns me the most, just like last year, is the supports. Vigilante is super exciting coming from Talon Esports. He looked super good on Zen. However, he won't be able to play until halfway through the season due to being underaged, which is what really drags the team down. Until then they have Opener and Krillin, neither of which are good supports, and their most recent results in contenders definitely don't help their case either. There were better options on the market in my opinion. Finally, the coaching. Supreme as the head coach again doesn't inspire much confidence, seeing as the Justice were pretty disappointing last year. Same goes for assistant coach Chilhua, who is also returning from last year. However, picking up Tydola could be good considering how successful the Glads were last year with him, but I don't think it's enough. Overall this roster has some really good players, especially with the DPS line, but also a lot of question marks with the support line and coaching staff, and I just don't see them surpassing all the top tier talent NA has to offer this year. Philadelphia Fusion. This one is hard to determine seeing as this roster is not yet complete, but they have some pretty good pieces so far. The best part of this roster so far has to be Carpe and Fury both returning. At their peaks both of these guys are some of the best players in the league and have both been consistently top tier throughout all 4 years of Overwatch League. And since the game is moving more towards a solo carry style, I predict Carpe will dominate in Overwatch 2. Because we all know what this guy is capable of when he's feeling it. On Cassidy, Tracer, Widow, Ashe, Hangzhou, and even Torb he's just a god. And Fury should make for a good solo tank, seeing as he's pretty good at all off tanks. His D.Va, Zarya, Sigma and Hog are all pretty good. However, the rest of this team I'm a little uncertain of. They promoted Zest and MN3, the DPS duo of their academy team T1. And these guys seem pretty promising. A solid projectile DPS and a second hit skin gives this DPS trio a very similar vibe to that of last year's trio. MN3 has a similar hero pool to Shockwaves and Zest has a similar hero pool to EQOs, so it should make for an interesting dynamic with Carpe. Then they signed Dame God to be their flex support, and I'm not too sure how to feel about this one. He's played in the league before but has always been on not so good rosters. but he has looked good for the time he did play. His most recent results in contenders have also shown some promise. However, it's painful to think how much more promising this roster would have looked if Alarm was still with us. Aimgad is a great player, but it's hard not to compare him to Alarm, and I just can't see his Ana and Zen play realistically matching some of the top dogs. Last is the coaching, and they do have some promise here as well. Jin as the head coach is good, seeing as his results with the Charge in Seasons 2 and 3 are both pretty positive, especially in Season 3, and assistant coach Chura has previous synergy with Jin as he was a player for that same Charge roster in Seasons 2 and 3. Despite not being a player anymore, the synergy is still there, which should do this team some good, and he was a coach for T1, so that's synergy with the org as well. Overall, this team has some very promising pieces but also some very well established ones, and I'm confident that the coaching staff can bring out the potential these players possess. However, I still feel that there are some better teams in APAC, nothing against the Fusion players and coaches. I just think a few teams in APAC are just a bit better. Atlanta Reign. This team feels quite strong. Starting with the good parts of the team, personally I think every member of this roster feels pretty solid. Gator, Hawk and Kai all returning from last year is nice to see. All of them were top 5 in their respective roles. Gator on Orisa and Rhine, and Hawk on Sigma and Diva made for a great tank line. And Kai on any hitscan or Hangzhou was very strong. The new signings they brought along also show lots of promise. Nero coming from the Shock is big. Despite being a downgrade to Pelican, he is very flexible and can play everything Pelican could play, things like the May, Echo, and Torb. Venom is their new Tracer player for Overwatch 2, and this guy played very well on it in NA contenders, so I have high hopes he can do well. Then the famous American Tornado support duo of OG and Ultraviolet. These guys have been dominating in NA contenders together for the past 2 years, and they are finally old enough to join the league. I personally am super pumped to see both these guys in action. Ultraviolet is a great Zen and BAP, and OG can play every main support and even BAP super well. This roster looks super good on paper. However, the more I think about the history of this team and the fact that we are heading into a new game, my opinion on this roster heavily changes. The coaching staff appears to be very similar to that of 2020. They have Sefi as head coach with assistant coaches Legit and Danny. As we all know, this Atlanta team was very mediocre back then. The loss of Unter was a big one. Every team that Guy touched has been super successful, and not having him is really gonna hurt. The coaches they have right now just don't inspire confidence. None of them have a super good reputation, and I am worried they won't be able to synergize the team well. And now that we are heading into Overwatch 2, I personally don't think Gator and Hawk will look as good. This is just my prediction, but since these guys play so well only when together, I think that separating them is gonna make both players not as good. Overall, this team feels strong, but I think some people are overhyping them a little bit. They're good, just not elite level in my opinion. I see them having a similar result to that of 2020, which is why they are in the exact same spot in the standings as they were in 2020. Boston Uprising. This team is filled with good talent. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is of course Striker returning to his old team for Overwatch 2. This is probably the best thing to happen to the Uprising since 2018. Getting Striker, a back-to-back champion and a Grand Finals MVP, is super big. His signature Tracer is obviously the star of the show, but he can also carry the team on Ashe, Cassidy, Hangzhou, and Reaper. He is by far the best player on the team, just as long as a short retirement didn't hurt his ability to play at a top level. The rest of this team is pretty solid as well. Valentine and Victoria make for 2 solid DPS partners for Striker. Both kind of fill in the gaps that Striker has in his hero pool with a bit of overlap. I expect Valentine to play a lot of the projectile things like Genji, Echo, and Pharah. Meanwhile, Victoria will probably play hitskins like Cassidy, Widow and some Hangzhou. The tank line is one that I think is a little underrated. Punk is a pretty consistent off-tank on D.Va, Sigma and even Hog. Meanwhile Marvel is good for being one of the most flexible tanks. Despite being a main tank player who also plays Sigma, the Dynasty forced him to play D.Va and Zarya due to not wanting to run Michelle. And despite not being super good at it, he does have D.Va and Zarya in his back pocket along with his main heroes, which are Sigma, Rhine, Ball, and despite his Winston and Orisa not being as good, they'll probably still be serviceable. But because of his flexibility, I think Marvel will turn out to be a great tank player in Overwatch 2. Now for the supports, MCD, Crimzo and Faith. Personally, I think this is another part of the team that is being underrated. Faith was in my opinion pretty solid last year and one of the more consistent players from last year's Uprising. Meanwhile MCD and Crimzo were both very good on their comfort picks. A Crimzo BAP and an MCD Ana could both take over a game, as seen by the fact that both players had 4-0 stages last year when mostly playing their heroes. These two should be great for a double flex support meta, and even for a normal meta they should both be great. However, similar to the Reign, this team has a clear issue at coaching. Keeping the exact same coaching staff from last year is a big issue considering how mediocre they were last year. Head coach Laurie and assistant coaches Burrow and Ascoft I just don't trust all that much, especially headed into a new game. Overall, the talent this team possesses is much better than that of last year's, but the coaches I feel could hold them back. So because of this, I've decided to put them right in the middle of the list.